Fair warning, this will be long. In 1997, my friend, who we'll call Chris, moved across state. At that time, we were 10, and we didn't really have much of a way to see each other besides getting a ride by our parents to one of the other's houses, which would be a hassle for our parents, so we eventually lost contact. During this time, I had only gotten the chance to visit his house once. With this story being in this subreddit, you'd expect the house to be creepy, but it really wasn't. It was a very plain split-level house, probably built in the early 80s, with neighbors close by, so it wasn't even secluded. Like I said, we lost contact with each other for 10 years. That is until Chris contacted a mutual friend through MySpace. I didn't actually have an account on that site. We made plans to hook up and hang out now that we have our own means of transportation, and it was a lot easier. After maybe a month of this, Chris mentioned that his family will be remodeling the house, and I offered my help. Him and his father gladly accepted the offer, since the previous owner or owners apparently didn't keep up on it themselves. A couple of weeks later, I drive one weekend, and we start tearing up, carpeting, ripping off wallpaper, etc. The basement had been changed into a room for Chris some years ago before, and while half of the floor was concrete, the other half seemed to have been torn up and replaced with floorboards, and one of the boards had become warped and broke, leaving it protruding up under the carpet, so they wanted to replace it. We tore the carpet up and started ripping out the floorboards when we found what looked like a hole dug about 5 feet into the ground under the floor. Chris jumped down, thinking he could get better leverage to tear up the boards when he said something was down there. His father got a flashlight, and we jumped down to check it out. It turned out to be a very worn box. It looked very similar to a shoebox, but it was about 3 feet long and extremely damaged by the elements. It was so tattered that you wouldn't even be able to pick it up in one piece. We believed that whatever was in it would be just as damaged, but when we ripped it open, we noticed that whatever was in it had the added protection of a black trash bag. Chris picked up the trash bag, and its contents made the sound of plastic hitting plastic. We were curious as to what's in there, so we brought it upstairs and cut the bag open with a pair of scissors and found 24 unmarked videotapes. Me and Chris were curious as to what was on them, but his father claimed that they were most likely somebody's old bootleg collection, and if we're still curious, we should check them out later after we were done for that day. Since the plan was for me to stay the night and help them out the next day and leave that Sunday night, we decided to watch them that night. Since Chris's father was tired and didn't really care what was on the tapes, he went to bed a little bit early that night. So we pulled their old VCR from their attic, hooked it up into the TV in Chris's room, and took one of the tapes out of the bag and slipped it in. The tapes certainly weren't bootlegged movies like Chris's father believed. They were the home movies of an unknown man we eventually began to call Butcherface. There was seemingly no flow from one scene to the next. It was like he would just film something random for what was usually just a couple of minutes, then put the camera away for God knows how long until he found something else that interested him. Most of the footage was random footage like him turning on the camera, facing a chair. He would walk out from behind the camera to the chair, push it over the floor, walk back to the camera, and turn it off. Or him playing with a random spider, which he would talk to in a low, childlike voice, then in the tape with him squashing it. Or him just filming down at his feet as he walks while deeply breathing. The one thing that always stuck out about all the footage is that on the few times that his face was shown, he was seen wearing what looked like a burlap sack tightly around his head, with twine with 2 eye holes cut out. He was also a big guy, being easily over 6 feet tall, with a decent build, with some muscles, but not being buff. A lot of the footage was a lot more creepy and sinister. Some of the footage was of him videotaping people living buildings and houses. He was obviously hiding somewhere across the street from these locations, and he was often breathing loudly. Even worse were the things he videotaped himself doing. One piece of footage showed him sitting at a table with a rat trapped in an empty large pickle jar. He unscrewed the pickle jar, took the rat out, slowly put his hand on its head, and started twisting until it stopped screaming. He twisted a little more until its head was completely ripped off the body. Then he turned the camera off. Another clip showed him in a barn, which there was no barn on my friend's property, so we don't know where this was filmed. He turned the camera on, showing a pig tied to a post. He walked over to the pig with an axe in his hand and hacked its head off. What was really creepy was that most of the footage was shot in what was now my friend's house. It was always dark in the footage. Like, this man didn't like to have lights on, but we did recognize various locations of the house. One piece of footage was obviously shot in the living room, which showed Butcherface using a large hunting knife to cut the power cord off of something we couldn't see, wrapping this cord tightly around his arm, grunting and moaning as he does it, and using the knife to cut deep cuts into his hand and arm. One disturbing clip showed him standing in front of a table in a kitchen. On the table was a clothes iron. He then unzipped his pants, took out his penis, put it on the table, and pressed the hot iron against it. He screamed, but didn't take it off for about 30 seconds. He finally took it off, limped over to the camera, and turned it off. What freaked us out the most was a clip of Butcherface in what used to be Chris's upstairs bedroom before he moved to the basement. He turned the camera on and showed the whole room covered in what appeared to be hundreds of lit candles. They were on every table, chair, and shelf. The walls were covered in paintings of grotesque and ghostly faces. He then walked to a corner of the room and started fiercely carving something into the floor with the hunting knife. He would stab it into the floor and drag it around, pull it out, and stab again. Since that room was vacant at the moment and used for storage, and was going to be renovated anyway, Chris's father let us tear up the carpet in that area of the room. What we found was a section of the floor had been heavily sanded down with no real evidence of what had been carved there. Another tape showed footage of Butcherface in that same room with even more candles. He was on his knees, facing away from the camera, with his arms in the air, screaming to be brought to the pits of pain and torture. One interesting thing about this clip is that he only had 3 fingers on his left hand, missing his pinky and ring finger. He had 5 fingers in the previous clips, and we think he cut them off. That was the last clip of that tape, and the camera appeared to run out of tape. The last piece of footage on the last tape showed Butcherface fiercely digging the hole that we found in the basement. He was digging fast and breathing heavily. He was constantly grunting. His shirt was off, but he still had the mask on. After a couple minutes of him just digging, he started talking, saying something like,
"This is it. This is it. They won't know. They'll never find me. This is where I'll hide."